All right, here we go with section 2, a near focus question. In December 1909, delegates from around the world met in Seattle, Washington for a meeting of the World Trade Organization, a group of nations formed in 1994 to reduce barriers to international commerce and settle trade disputes. Surprising many, more than 30,000 people participated in protests, including factory workers criticizing global free trade for encouraging U.S. corporations to move production to low wage countries, and environmentalists complaining of the impact of unregulated economic development on the ecology. The protesters, hundreds of whom were arrested, succeeded in disrupting the WTO meeting, which was disbanded. The Seattle area is home to Microsoft, the computer company whose software runs most of the world's computers. Few companies better symbolize globalization, the process by which people, investment, goods, information, and culture flow across national borders. Yet globalization was not a new phenomenon. The internationalization of commerce and culture and mass migrations had occurred since at least the 15th century. But the scale and scope of late 20th century globalization were unprecedented. Thanks to new technologies, information and culture spread instantaneously throughout the world. Manufacturers and financial institutions searched the world for profitable opportunities. Perhaps most important, the collapse of communism between 1989 and 1991 opened the entire world to market capitalism and ideas that government should interfere as little as possible in the economy. The free world had triumphed over communism, the free market had triumphed over the planned economy, and the free individual had triumphed over community and social citizenship. Politicians increasingly criticized economic and environmental regulation and welfare as burdens on international competition. In the 1990s, Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton both spoke of an American mission to create a single world market that would raise living standards, spread democracy, and promote greater freedom in the world. Soon, more protests at economic summits followed. The media called groups who organized them the anti globalization movement. Yet, these groups did not challenge globalization, but rather its social consequences. They argued that globalization increased wealth, but also widened gaps between rich and poor countries and between haves and have nots within societies. Decisions affecting the lives of millions of people were being made by institutions like the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and multinational corporations that operated without any democratic input. These international organizations required developing nations seeking financial aid to open their economies to penetration from abroad while reducing spending on domestic social concerns. Protests called not for an ending of global trade and capital flows, but for the creation of global standards for wages, labor conditions, and the environment, and more investment in health and education in poor nations. And the Battle of Seattle placed on the U.S. and world agendas the most pressing concern of the new century: the relationship of globalization, economic justice, and freedom. Clinton's popularity rested heavily on America's remarkable economic expansion in the mid and late 1990s after an earlier recession. Because Reagan and Bush left behind enormous deficits, Clinton tried hard to balance the budget, and economic growth actually produced so much government revenue that in his second term, Clinton not only balanced the budget, but also produced budget surpluses. Many in the 1990s hailed the birth of a new economy in which computers and the internet would create enormous new efficiencies in the production and sale of information, would replace manufacturing as the center of the U.S. economy. Computers, which were first developed after World War II, improved remarkably in the 1960s and 70s, especially because of miniaturization of parts through the microchip. Microchips made possible a wave of new consumer products in the 1980s and 1990s, including video cassette recorders, handheld video games, cell phones, and digital cameras. Beginning in the 1980s, companies such as Apple and IBM sold computers for business and home use, and soon computers were used in all kinds of workplaces. They also changed private life, and centers of computer technology produced local economic booms in places such as Silicon Valley, Seattle, Austin, and Manhattan. The Internet, which was first developed as a high speed military communications network, was simplified and open to commercial and individual use through personal computers. The Internet expanded the flow of information and communications more radically than any invention since the printing press, and democratized information at a time when the ownership of newspapers, TV stations, and publishing was being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. On the other hand, the Internet also provided for racists, conspiracy theorists, and others a platform for the dissemination of misinformation. Economic growth and talk of a new economy sparked a frenzied boom in the stock market that was reminiscent of the 1920s. Investors, large and small, poured funds into stocks, spurred by the rise of discount and online firms that advertised aggressively and charged lower fees than traditional brokers. Investors were especially attracted to the new dot-coms, companies that conducted business via the internet and seemed to symbolize the promise of the new economy. The bubble burst on April 14, 2000, when stocks suffered the largest one-day point drop in history. Talk of a new economy, it appeared, had been premature. Only after the market dropped did it become apparent that the stock boom of the 1990s had been fueled in part by fraud. For a time in 2001 and 2002, Americans were treated almost daily to revelations of incredible greed and corruption on the part of respected brokerage firms, accountants, and company executives. Enron, a Houston based energy company that epitomized the new economy, it bought and sold electricity rather than actually producing it, reported as profits billions of dollars in operating losses. At the height of the 1990s boom, free trade and deregulation seemed the right economic model. But the retreat from government economic regulations, embraced by both Republican Congress and President Clinton, left no one to represent the public interest. The sectors most affected by the scandals, such as energy, telecommunications, and stock trading, had all been deregulated. Many stock frauds, for example, stemmed from the repeal in 1999 of the Glass-Steagall Act, a New Deal law that separated commercial banks, which accepted deposits and made loans, from investment banks, which invested in stocks and real estate and took larger risks. This repeal created superbanks with both functions. These banks engaged in huge risks, knowing that the federal government would have to bail them out if they failed. Conflicts of interest were everywhere. Banks financed new stocks offered by new internet firms, while their investment arms sold the shares to the public. These banks also poured money into risky mortgages. When the housing bubble collapsed in 2007 and 2008, the banks suffered losses that threatened the entire financial system. The Bush and Obama administrations felt they had no choice but to spend billions of dollars in taxpayer money to save the banks from their own misconduct. The boom that began in 1995 benefited most Americans. For the first time since the early 1970s, average real wages and family incomes began to rise significantly. With low unemployment, economic expansion hiked wages for families at all income levels, even aiding low skilled workers. Yet average wages for non supervisory workers after inflation stayed below 1970s levels. Overall, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the poor and middle class became worse off while the wealthy became significantly richer. The wealth of the richest Americans exploded in the 1990s. Bill Gates, head of Microsoft and the nation's richest person, owned as much wealth as the bottom 40% of the US population put together. Dot-com millionaires and well-paid computer designers and programmers received much publicity. Moreover, business increasingly relied on profits from financial operations rather than making things. By 2000, the financial sector of the economy accounted for 40% of total profits. Companies continued to shift manufacturing overseas. Because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, many factories moved to Mexico, where, just across the border, U.S. firms enjoyed cheaper labor and weak environmental and safety regulations. All of this lowered prices, but put American workers in competition with those around the globe, producing a relentless downward pressure on American wages. Overall, between 1990 and 2008, companies that did business in global markets contributed almost nothing to job growth in the United States. For example, in 2010, Apple employed 43,000 people in the United States, but its contractors manufacturing its popular products employed 700,000 people, almost all of them overseas. In the early 21st century, Walmart was the country's largest corporate employer and paid its 1.6 million workers slightly more than minimum wage and engaged in virulent anti-union initiatives. Thanks to NAFTA, by 2010, Walmart was also the largest employer in the country. So that'll end section 2. We'll be back for section 3.